Hi, Misha here, and I need another break from work. The shotgun buying is still continuing. A little slower today, but still continuing, but it is the middle of the week. So I felt like revisiting and really expanding upon one of the most interesting, one of my favorite Soviet aircraft and MiGs. The MiG-25 Foxbat. On the left, I have a Foxbat A, as NATO referred to it, from the Iraqi Air Force, Gulf War. And on the right, I have a Foxbat E from the Libyan Air Force from the Gulf of Sidra affair. The E is basically the same as the A. It just has an updated radar, engines, and a few other things. This was a Soviet high-performance interceptor and also a reconnaissance plane. Developed to go higher and faster than anything else, and in many ways they succeeded, and they pushed Soviet industry ahead quite a bit when doing so. On the other hand, it was also, in some areas, surprisingly conservative and kind of old school. So in other words, very Soviet. Yeah, this has its genesis post-World War II. The Soviet Air Defense Forces, not the Soviet Air Force, more of a strategic organization, were given the task of protecting the entire airspace of the USSR, as vast as it was, from accidental incursions, Western bombers, Western reconnaissance planes. And by the 1950s, the West was really getting advanced with their bombers and planes going from subsonic to supersonic. And so something new was needed, a new interceptor. Even if it was just more of a deterrent, they needed something that could go up against and, if necessary, eliminate Western bombers before they could drop, theoretically, nuclear weapons. So in 1958, a directive was sent out from the Politburo, the central government, essentially, for a new interceptor. The specifications, basically, it needed to be able to get up to about 1,900 miles per hour and climb to over 88,000 feet, carrying advanced air-to-air missiles and needing a very modern, very powerful radar. And the two companies that you would expect responded: Sukhoi and MiG. The MiG Design Bureau had already been kind of sketching out several design concepts and proposals for various interceptors, heavy and standard, in the 1950s. So by 1959, they already got to work on what would become the MiG-25. They did play around with the design. They knew they needed two engines, two massive engines. As we see here, they went with a pretty standard side-by-side, but they did consider doing them vertical, like on the English Electric Lightning. They even considered them putting them under the wings and nacelles, kind of like the Messerschmitt 262. They did consider going to a sweep wing, a variable geometry wing, but it really wouldn't give any advantage because this needed to be a high-speed, high-altitude plane, and really only sweep wings are good if you need to go slow and low sometimes. This has a crew of just the one pilot, but they did even consider having two, so a second person there to help man the radar and be the navigator. But in the end, they decided with newer technologies, it just wasn't necessary. And yeah, the first prototype, which was rather different than the final production model, but the first inkling, flew in March of 1964. And quite interestingly, it wasn't the Interceptor variant, it was a prototype of the Reconnaissance, the photo variant. It would not be until September of that year that the prototype for the Interceptor would fly. They would learn quite a bit from these prototypes. They would refine the design, and then in July, in an air show, they would first show off the new aircraft to the public. They would show 4 of them. 3 would be Interceptor pre-productions, and 1 would be a photo reconnaissance pre-production. A few last-minute changes would be made, and then the reconnaissance version would be ordered into production in 1969. And the Interceptor went into production a short time later in 1971. NATO codenamed these the Foxbat. The Interceptor was the Foxbat A, and the Reconnaissance was the Foxbat B. And this was, and still even is today, a very impressive feat. It is one of the fastest and highest flying aircraft ever built. And when it comes to actual serial production aircraft, it's only second to the Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird. But the Blackbird, of course, was a reconnaissance aircraft made in much smaller numbers. And the Blackbird is now retired. The MiG-25 is still flying, so in a way it kind of regained its title. It set many records throughout the 60s and early 70s, nearly 30 of them. Over half a dozen were world records. A few even still stand to this very day. In tests and with special models, it could get up to over 120,000 feet in the air, though the military version capped out at about 89,000 feet with payload. It had a theoretical max speed of Mach 3.2, but the max speed was practically limited at Mach 2.83, because past that the engines would overheat and basically just rip themselves apart, just destroy themselves. In fact, even at 2.8, it could only sustain it for a few minutes. Rather, it had a comfortable cruise speed of about 2.35, where it actually liked it, and was surprisingly fuel efficient. However, at low speeds, it was not. This was designed to go fast. It had a very powerful radar, capable of detecting targets a ways off and punching through lots of interference. It had a total of 5 underbelly hardpoints. The center one could be used for a fuel tank. Each wing had 2. Standard equipment were a total of 4 R-40T missiles. These either could have semi-radar, active radar guide, or they can be heat-seeking infrared types. The aircraft was made primarily of stainless steel. They really wanted to use titanium, but this is Russia. They also wanted to produce these in the hundreds or thousands, and it wasn't in the budget. So they only used a little bit of titanium where absolutely necessary. Otherwise, it was stainless steel. They had to use a high-temperature plexiglass for the cockpit. They did, and the plane was assembled with a mix of welding and riveting. Interestingly, quite a few rivets were not flush rivet, especially where it didn't matter, like internals and things. It was an odd mix of old and new. It had a very powerful radar, if not cutting edge. It had very powerful engines, if a bit simple. On the other hand, it still used vacuum tube technology for its electronics, not solid state. But this had some advantages. Aside from just being good, steady, reliable tech, it was more dependable and at the time easier to service. People knew vacuum tubes. It was also proofed against a potential EMP. So in the event of nuclear war, these could still fly, theoretically. If there was anything to fly through it left. Their primary design in the interceptor with these 4 large long-range missiles was to shoot down bombers or reconnaissance aircraft. The reconnaissance version of the MiG-25, the MiG-25R, was actually very important and in some ways quite influential. The Soviet Union would actually station them in Egypt in the early 70s, doing overflies of Israeli territory. They would pull them out in 72 when tensions between the Egyptian and Russian governments were high, but they would bring them back in October of 73 during the Yom Kippur War, again providing reconnaissance for the Egyptians and Russians over Israel. And then they would pull them out again in 74. They would continue to overfly Iran before the fall of the Shah because the Iranians were the U.S. allies. And these would be routinely sent after Blackbirds, SR-71s, as they were overflying, especially in like the North Atlantic or the Baltic. Basically just chasing the Blackbird. Even though the Blackbird was faster, the Foxbat was close, and Russia had quite a number of them. And more than once, these were tracked on radar going past that 2.8 Mach limit, at least up to Mach 3, and at least one time recorded at Mach 3.2. So it was more than just a theoretical limit, especially if you didn't mind destroying your engines in the process. But it was a very capable aircraft, but not perfect, which is why they switched from what was originally the MiG-25P, the Foxbat A, to the MiG-25PD, Foxbat E. This version here, the MiG-25PD, exists primarily because of one PVO, Russian pilot, Viktor Belenko. In 1976, he flew his brand new MiG-25P, defected, and sorta kinda crash landed in Japan on an airfield, seeking asylum. Obviously he was granted this, and the Japanese invited the Americans to come check out his ride, and of course the Soviets protested, just as America would do in the same situation. America ignored them for a time. A couple of months later, they did return the plane to Russia in pieces. They took it apart, examined everything, didn't bother putting it back together. You know, no pretense. Of course, Russia would do the same too, so, you know, mutual. Now, up until this point, the West had some pretty tall tales about the MiG-25. They saw the big wing, They knew she was fast. They also thought she was maneuverable. They knew she had a big radar. They perceived it to be very modern and capable. But once they took Belenko's plane apart, they realized a few things. While she was fast, her maneuverability was pretty mediocre, to say the least, especially at low speeds. She liked to go fast, and she was pretty bad at going slow. The big wing was because she weighed a lot, which surprised them. Again, like I said, they used stainless steel for a lot of the construction, eschewing titanium as much as possible. But the real shocker was the radar. Powerful it was, but advanced it really wasn't. Namely, it lacked look-down, shoot-down capability, something that the Americans began to use in the mid-1960s. So they pinpointed a very clear weakness in the original MiG-25P. In late '76, the military ordered this be rectified, that a new version be created, borrowing heavily from the MiG-23's radar. The MiG-25PD was introduced in 1978. It had a new pulse Doppler radar that was look-down, shoot-down capable. And while they were at it, they did improve the engines and added a little more in the ordnance ability. The plane always had a limited ground attack, being able to carry 500-kilogram iron bombs, which were, pretty effective being dropped from big heights, and they had pretty good range considering the speed. But they would add the ability, instead of carrying 4 large, bomber killer type missiles, they could carry 2 of those, and then 4, 2 on each outer pylon, anti-air missiles, anti-fighter missiles, giving it more of a fighter defense. Because before, it really didn't have much, because no cannon on this plane. The MiG-25P would actually remain in production until the early 80s, but most of the Ps would be upgraded with the new radar being designated MiG-25PDS, and production would continue until 1984, with just under 1,200 built in Russia. Now, there was a planned improved or modernized version, the MiG-25M. They would have greater speed than Mach 2.8 and newer weapons, but instead the MiG-31 was selected for the next generation of interceptors. Nevertheless, the MiG-25 soldiered on in Russia until the late 1990s, and in other nations even till today. One major user was Iraq, which again this model was from, wherever I put her, there it is. They flew the MiG-25 during the 80s, during the Iran-Iraq War. They had well over a dozen kills, somewhere between 15 and 20. Iranian planes were shot down, and they only lost 3 MiG-25s to all causes. And then this model here, this plane model, in 1991, January, the opening day of the first Gulf War, this was the only plane to really get and shoot down an Allied aircraft, a coalition aircraft. This MiG-25, originally P, later upgraded to be a PDS, shot down an FA-18 Hornet, earning it the name Hornet Killer. And that would be the only air-to-air victory for the Iraqi Air Force during that short war. On the other hand, the MiG-25 acquitted itself quite well. 2 were lost to coalition fighters, but most were able to actually outrun their pursuing F-15s, FA-18s, F-16s, what have you. They were still fast, even in the 90s. Speeds don't really change. So while they only got 1 kill, they only lost 2 in that war. Now, a third was shot down in 1992 after the war that had entered the no-fly zone. And this would be the first time the F-16 would get an air-to-air victory for America. Kind of interesting. Iraq would continue to fly these. In December of 2002, an Iraqi MiG-25 would shoot down a Predator drone, being the first time that a manned fighter shot down a drone like that. However, by 2003, the Second Iraq War, the MiG-25 was not used. Most were hidden or were destroyed while they were still on the ground, so they weren't really a factor in the Second War. This one here is from the Libyan Air Force, circa 1981. Libya would acquire 96 MiG-25s, a mix of PDs and RBs. And that's where they would get tangled up in the Gulf of Sidra affair. Originally, a couple of Libyan Su-22s would be shot down by American Tomcats, and then later in response, MiG-25s would be sent out as a, response. The whole thing was that Libya had kind of extended what it claimed as its own territorial waters in the 70s, and the West didn't recognize this claim, and so Ronald Reagan, newly president, kind of put this claim to the test by going in them. They would continue to fly their MiG-25s through the 80s, but by the 90s they were running out of spare parts and many of the airframes were getting aged, so they were put in storage, which means when the Allies bombed during the Civil War in 2011, the MiG-25s were not targeted because they were a non-factor. However, in 2015, some were pulled out of storage and refurbished and used again in the war, but not really to any effect to be worth anything. Another major user was Syria. Also in 1981, February, the Israeli Air Force kind of baited them. They sent a couple of F-4 Phantoms into Syrian airspace to draw their fighters out. Then the Phantoms returned back to Israeli airspace, and the MiG-25s pursued. And they were quickly pounced upon by F-15s. One was shot down and one escaped. Later that year in July, another Syrian-flown MiG-25 would be shot down. And Syria would continue to fly these until its own civil war, and they were spotted in 2014 and whatnot. Thing is, the plane was durable, thanks to its simple vacuum tube construction, stainless steel thing. It's that Russian dependability and relatively ease of maintenance. And it is fast. Even to this day, it holds some records and is nothing to be sneezed at. But at the same time, it is very clearly 1960s technology. But because of this, the F-15 became what it is today. Without the MiG-25 as kind of sword of Damocles dangling over their heads. They may not have pushed the development, the design of the MiG, of the F-15 as far as they did, because they weren't sure of this aircraft's capability, so they just kind of planned and anticipated the worst. And while it was very good, it was an interceptor. It was made for a very specific purpose. It's not a dogfighter, and while it has a limited ground attack capability, it's not a fighter bomber. And that's about it. And both of these models are from Hobby Master. They're 1/72 scale die-cast. They have the usual Hobby Master features. They have the ability to display with gear up or down. You can attach the ordnance or not. Canopy can either be displayed open or closed, and there's a pilot figure. Actually, kind of funny how small the cockpit is on these. It's a very heavy plane. As you see, it's very big. The real plane is about 65 feet long and about 46-foot wingspan. So even translate down to 1/72 scale. That's pretty big. So it has a lot of weight to it. The base is plastic, but the stem is metal, and it's the kind I like that plugs in. It plugs in the bottom. The only bad thing is it takes the same slot that the fuel tank does. It does come with the big single external long-range fuel tank. I would really like to display it with the tank on, but it's either stand or tank, and I prefer stand. I'm just not big on gear down if I can help it. They're quite durable, and again, pretty much all metal. The tail fins are plastic, but the main wing, the fuselage, the nose, all metal, and the underside, all metal, at least except for the wheel doors and stuff. So they do have a decent little heft to them. Unfortunately, a lot of these Soviet planes from Hobby Master now are pretty expensive. Maybe even too expensive. I don't know why their MiGs are so pricey. It may be a licensing thing with McCoy. But, yep. Just felt like visiting a Soviet aircraft again. Haven't done so in quite a while. The MiG-25, while it's out of Russian service, it did outlive the Soviet Union, and is still in limited service with a few kind of, I guess you'd call them third rate. I'm not trying to be derogatory, but you know what I mean. Air forces. Its main thing, its performance is still good, but its weapons ability is pretty dated, and its lack of really computer systems and stuff, at least modern computer systems, really shows. And even, of course, its updated PD radar is getting quite dated by now. I wish Hobby Master did a Reconnaissance version, but they don't. But they only do, I think, 5, maybe 6 of these total. So maybe one day they'll do a Recon. But yeah, I just wanted to have a Foxbat A and a Foxbat E, displaying one with all 4 big missiles, and then another one with the 4 little air-to-air missiles, and then the 2 big ones. Differences. Anyway, if you enjoyed this, I appreciate it. If you could like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.